I've been on this bench for a very long time, and if there's one thing that never ceases to amaze me, it's the way people think they can just invent their own version of the law when it suits their wallet. They walk in here with these homemade contracts, these handshake agreements, and a total lack of common sense, expecting me to nod along with their nonsense. It doesn't work that way. The law isn't a buffet where you pick and choose the parts you like. I looked at the file in front of me. Mark Sullivan, 28, suing Greg Miller, 45. The amount? $2,000. The reason? A motorcycle deposit that went south faster than a cheap tire on a gravel road. Bird, I called out, not even looking up from the papers. Yes, Judge, he said, already standing by the gate. Let's get these two in here. I'm in no mood for a fairy tale today. Mark Sullivan walked in looking like a deer in headlights. He was wearing a tie that was tied too short and carrying a folder like it was a shield. Across from him, Greg Miller marched in with the swagger of a man who thought he was the smartest person in the room. He had a leather jacket on inside a courtroom and a look on his face that told me he was going to be a problem. Bird, swear them in, I said. Once they were sworn, I leaned forward and fixed my gaze on Mark. Mr. Sullivan, you are suing Mr. Miller for $2,000. You say you gave him this money as a deposit on a 2022 Harley-Davidson, and that when you changed your mind less than 24 hours later, he refused to give you a dime back. Is that the gist of it? Yes, Judge Judy, Mark said, his voice a bit thin. I saw the bike on Facebook Marketplace on Monday. I went to see it Tuesday afternoon. It was beautiful, but it was a lot of money, $12,000. Greg told me he had 3 other guys coming to look at it that evening, and that if I wanted him to hold it, I had to put down $2,000 right then and there. $2,000 is a hefty deposit for a $12,000 bike, I noted. That's nearly 20%. Did you have the cash on you? I Zelled it to him, Judge. He said it was non-refundable, but I thought that meant if I disappeared for a month. I didn't think it meant he'd keep it if I called him the next morning. I turned my eyes to Greg Miller. He was leaning against his podium like it was a bar counter. Mr. Miller, stand up straight. This isn't a pool hall, it's a courtroom. He straightened up, but the smug look didn't leave his face. Your Honor, a deal is a deal. He signed a receipt that clearly stated non-refundable deposit. I took the ad down. I told the other buyers it was sold. I lost time, I lost opportunities, and I lost my patience. You lost your patience? I barked. I'm about 2 seconds away from losing mine, sir, and trust me, you won't like the result. Show me the receipt. Bird brought the paper over. It was a piece of notebook paper with jagged edges. In shaky handwriting, it said, deposit for 2022, Harley, $2,000. Non-refundable. Balance due Friday. Greg Miller. Underneath was Mark's signature. Mr. Miller, I said, tapping the paper. You wrote this? I did. And Mr. Sullivan, you signed it? I did, Judge, but shush, I said, holding up a hand. I'm talking to the businessman over here. Mr. Miller, you received the money at what time on Tuesday? Around 5 p.m., Greg said. And Mr. Sullivan, what time did you call him to cancel? 8:30 the next morning, Mark replied. I realized overnight that with my student loans and my rent increase, I just couldn't swing the monthly payments. I called him as soon as I woke up. I apologized. I told him I knew I messed up, but I asked for the deposit back minus maybe $50 for his trouble. I looked at Greg. So he notified you in 15 and a half hours, most of which you were presumably asleep. Is that correct? It doesn't matter if it was 15 minutes, Greg snapped. The paper says non-refundable. That's a contract. In the real world, Judge, when you break a contract, there are consequences. Oh, don't tell me about the real world, Mr. Miller, I yelled. I've spent more time in the real world than you've spent in that leather jacket. Let's talk about your damages. You said you took the ad down. How long does it take to click Where List on Facebook? 3 seconds? Maybe 4 if your thumb is tired? It's the principle, Greg said, his voice getting defensive. I had to tell 3 other guys the bike was gone. By the time I called them back Wednesday morning, 2 of them had already bought other bikes. Do you have their names? I asked. Do you have their numbers? Do you have any proof whatsoever that you had 3 eager buyers lined up with $12,000 in their pockets on a Tuesday night? I don't keep a log of every Facebook message, Judge Gregg muttered. Then it's baloney, I screamed. It's a convenient story you're telling to justify stealing $2,000 from this kid for doing absolutely nothing. You didn't transport the bike. You didn't prep the bike. You didn't even have time to get the grease off your fingernails before he called you back. He signed the paper, Judge Judy. Gregg repeated, clinging to that notebook scrap like it was the Constitution. Non-refundable means non-refundable. Sir, listen to me carefully because I'm only going to say this once. I said, leaning over the bench until I could see the sweat on his forehead, liquidated damages, which is what a non-refundable deposit is supposed to be, must bear some relation to actual or anticipated loss. If you keep $2,000 for 15 hours of work that consists of nothing, that's not a deposit. That's a penalty. And the law doesn't allow you to penalize people just because you feel like it. He backed out, Gregg shouted. He wasted my time. Your time isn't worth $130 an hour, Mr. Miller. I calculated quickly. If we divide $2,000 by 15 hours, including the time you were sleeping, you're charging him a king's ransom for the privilege of having his Zelle notification pop up on your phone. It's outrageous, it's greedy, and it's not going to happen in my courtroom. I turned back to Mark. Why did you sign it if it said non-refundable, Mark? You're 28 years old. You should know better. I was caught up in the moment, Judge, Mark said, looking ashamed. The bike was perfect. He was very high pressure. He kept saying, first come, first served, and this won't last an hour. I thought I was just securing the deal. He was high pressure because he saw Mark, said looking back at Gregg. He saw a young man who wanted a toy, and he decided to set a trap. Mr. Miller, did you sell the bike eventually? Gregg hesitated. Yeah, I sold it 2 weeks later. For how much? $11,500. So you sold it for $500 less than what Mark was going to pay. Is that what you're saying? Yeah, because the market cooled off. The market cooled off in 2 weeks in the middle of summer. Give me a break. I turned to Bird. Bird, does it look like the North Pole in here? Because Mr. Miller seems to think we're in a deep freeze. Bird just cracked a tiny smile. So I continued, even if I were to be generous and say you lost $500 on the sale price because Mark wasted your time, that still leaves $1,500 of his money in your pocket for no reason other than spite. But I don't even believe you lost the $500. I think you're lying about the sale price just like you're lying about the 3 other buyers. I have a right to that money, Gregg insisted, slamming his hand on the podium. You don't have a right to a penny, I yelled back. You haven't shown me one bit of evidence that you suffered $2,000 worth of damage in 15 hours. Not one. I reached for my pen. I felt the tension in the room rising. Gregg was turning a bright shade of purple, and Mark was looking hopeful. But I wasn't done with Mr. Miller yet. Not by a long shot. I wanted to know exactly what he did with that $2,000 the moment he got it. Mr. Miller, I said, leaning forward and lowering my voice to that quiet, dangerous level that usually makes smart people start sweating. I want to know exactly what you did with that $2,000 the moment it hit your Zelle account. Did you put it in a savings account? Did you let it sit there while you waited to see if the deal closed on Friday? Or did you go out and spend it like you just won a scratch-off ticket? Gregg shifted his weight, his leather jacket creaking. I had bills, Judge. I used it to pay my rent and a couple of credit card payments. It was my money. The deal was struck. The deal was struck for a motorcycle. I snapped. The $2,000 was a down payment on a purchase that hadn't happened yet. You don't spend a deposit before the title changes hands. That's not business. That's a desperate man looking for a payday. You spent his money within hours, didn't you? That's why you had a meltdown when he called you on Wednesday morning. It wasn't about the bike. It was about the fact that you'd already spent money you didn't have. I didn't have a meltdown, Gregg muttered, though his jaw was so tight I thought he might crack a tooth. Oh, really? I looked at Mark. Mr. Sullivan, tell me about that phone call at 8:30 a.m. How did Mr. Miller react when you told him you couldn't go through with the sale? Mark took a shaky breath. He lost it, Judge. I started by saying I was really sorry and that I'd made a mistake. He didn't even let me finish. He started screaming. He called me every name in the book. He told me I was a lowlife and a time waster. When I asked about getting the deposit back, he laughed and told me to come and get it in a way that sounded like a threat. Then he hung up on me and blocked my number instantly. I turned my gaze back to Greg. Blocked his number? If you're a legitimate businessman who truly believes he has a legal right to keep a deposit, you don't block the person. You have a conversation. You explain the situation. You don't act like a thug who just pulled off a heist. I don't have to talk to people who disrespect my time, Greg said, his voice rising. I told him it was non-refundable. He signed the paper. If he can't read, that's his problem, not mine. I have a business to run. What business? I asked, looking him up and down. The business of selling one used motorcycle on Facebook? That's not a business, Mr. Miller. That's a hobby. And right now, it's a hobby that's costing you a lot of credibility. Now, let's talk about this losses you claim. You said you sold the bike for $11,500 2 weeks later. Bird, where is the bill of sale for that second transaction? Bard looked through the papers Greg had submitted. There isn't one, Judge. Just a printout of a Facebook message from someone named Big Mike saying thanks for the bike. I laughed. It wasn't a nice laugh. A message from Big Mike? Sir, do you think I'm stupid? Do you think I was born yesterday? You expect me to believe you sold a $12,000 asset for a $500 loss based on a thanks from a guy named Big Mike? It's the truth, Greg yelled. It's a lie, I yelled back, slamming the gavel for emphasis. You didn't submit a bill of sale because it would show you sold that bike for the full $12,000 or maybe even more. You kept this kid's $2,000 as a bonus for yourself. It's called unjust enrichment, and in my courtroom, we don't allow it. He broke the contract. Greg was practically vibrating with rage now. He slammed his fist onto the podium. You can't just ignore the word non-refundable. It was written right there. He's a grown man. He should be held accountable. Don't you dare slam your hand in my courtroom. I stood up, pointing a finger directly at his face. You want to talk about accountability? Let's talk about yours. You think that because you wrote a word on a scrap of notebook paper, you can bypass the laws of this state? A non-refundable clause is not a license to steal. It is meant to protect a seller from actual damages. You have shown me zero damages. You didn't even have to repay for the ad. It's Facebook. It's free. I lost those other buyers, Greg screamed. They were ready to go. Then call them back, I countered. If they were so ready to go on Tuesday night, they would have been just as ready on Wednesday morning. You didn't call them back because they didn't exist. You used them as a high-pressure tactic to squeeze $2,000 out of this kid, and then you prayed he'd back out so you could keep it. I sat back down, trying to keep my temper in check. This man represented everything I hate about private sales. The tough guy routine, the fake contracts, the total lack of empathy for a young person making a mistake. Mr. Sullivan, I said, looking at Mark, did you ever go to his house to try to resolve this in person? No, Judge, Mark said. After the way he screamed at me on the phone, I was actually scared to go there. I'm a student. I've never even been in a fight. He sounded like he wanted to hurt me. And that was the plan, wasn't it, Mr. Miller? I asked. Intimidate him. Block him. Make him feel like it's not worth the trouble to fight for his money. Well, you picked the wrong kid today because he found his way to me. This is ridiculous, Greg muttered, crossing his arms over his leather jacket. I'm the victim here. I'm the one who had a bike taking up space in my garage for 2 extra weeks because of him. I should be suing him for storage fees. Storage fees for a garage you already own? I rolled my eyes so hard I thought I'd see the back of my brain. Sir, your arrogance is only exceeded by your stupidity. You didn't lose a dime. You gained $2,000 for 15 hours of doing absolutely nothing. If I let you keep that money, I'd be an accomplice to your little scam. I looked at the receipts again. $2,000. Zelle. Tuesday, 5:04 p.m. Cancellation text. Wednesday, 8:28 a.m. Mr. Miller, You said you paid your rent with this money. How much is your rent? It's $1,800, he said. So you didn't even have enough money to pay your own rent until this kid walked into your yard, I asked. Is that why you were so desperate to lock him in? Is that why you insisted on a $2,000 deposit for a bike you were supposedly sure would sell in an hour? Greg didn't answer. He just glared at the wall. That's what I thought, I said. You were broke, you were desperate, and you saw an opportunity to solve your financial problems on Mark's dime. You didn't care about the bike. You cared about the Zelle notification. And the moment it arrived, you spent it. I looked at Mark. Mark, you made a mistake. You shouldn't have put down that kind of money without being 100% sure. You're lucky this wasn't a dealership, because they have much better lawyers than Mr. Miller over here. But even in a private sale, you have to be smarter. I know, Judge Mark said quietly, but I continued. Just because you made a mistake doesn't mean Mr. Miller gets a windfall. He's entitled to be made whole, not to be made rich. I turned back to Greg. I'm going to give you one last chance to be a human being, Mr. Miller. Are you willing to return $1,800 of that deposit and keep $200 for your time and trouble? No, Greg snapped. Not a penny. He signed the paper. I nodded slowly. I knew he was going to say that. A man like Greg Miller doesn't know when to take a graceful exit. He'd rather crash the bike than admit he's wrong. Fine, I said, picking up my pen. If you won't be reasonable, then I'll be legal. And you're not going to like legal nearly as much as you like that Zelle transfer. I looked at the file one last time. There was something else in the text messages, something Greg had said right before he blocked Mark. Bird, read the last text message Mr. Miller sent before he blocked the plaintiff, I commanded. Bird cleared his throat and read from the printout. Don't bother calling back, kid. I already spent the money on parts for my other bike. Consider this an expensive lesson in how the real world works. Suck it up. The courtroom went silent. Even Greg looked a little uncomfortable for a split second before he masked it with a sneer. Parts for your other bike, I asked, my voice dangerously low. I thought you said you used it for rent, Mr. Miller. Which is it, rent or parts? Or are you just so used to lying that you can't keep track of which lie you're telling? Greg opened his mouth to respond, but I held up a hand. Don't say another word. You've already proven you're a liar and a bully. Now I'm going to prove that the real world works a little differently than you think. Sir, you are a walking contradiction in a cheap leather jacket, I said, leaning back and letting the silence hang over him like a heavy fog. 10 minutes ago, you were a struggling man who had to pay his rent. Now, according to your own text message, which you were too arrogant to realize would end up in my hands, you're a tough guy buying parts for your other toy. Which is it? Because both can't be true, and in my courtroom, if you lie about one thing, I assume you're lying about everything. Greg scowled. It doesn't matter what I spent it on. The money was mine the second it hit my account. That's what non-refundable means. Why are we even talking about my rent? This is about him breaking a contract. No, sir. This is about you being a predator, I shouted, slamming the gavel so hard the water in Greg's cup rippled. A deposit is not a gift. It is not a prize you win for being a high-pressure salesman. It is a security for the performance of a contract. When the contract isn't performed, especially when you are notified within 15 hours, you are entitled to keep an amount that covers your actual losses. You haven't shown me a single loss. You haven't shown me a listing fee. You haven't shown me a mechanic's bill. You haven't shown me anything but your own greed. I turned to Mark, who was watching Greg with a mix of fear and fascination. Mark, after he blocked you, did you try to see if the ad was still up? I had my roommate check his Facebook marketplace, Judge Mark said. The ad was still up. It was never marked as pending or sold. It stayed up all through Wednesday and Thursday. He didn't lose any buyers because the ad never even changed. I whipped my head back to Greg. Is that true, Mr. Miller? Did you leave the ad up? I might have forgotten to toggle the status, Greg stammered, his bravado finally starting to leak out of his boots. I'm busy. I have a lot going on. I figured since he flaked, I'd just leave it up for the next guy. But you told me under oath that you told 3 other guys it was sold, I screamed. If you told them it was sold, why was the ad still active? If you were so damaged by having to relist it, why didn't you actually have to relist it? You are a liar, Mr. Miller. You are a bold-faced, unrepentant liar who thought he could bully a student out of $2,000. I have rights, Greg yelled, his face now a deep, pulsing crimson. This is America. You can't just take my money and give it to him because you don't like my attitude. I'm not taking your money, sir. I'm returning his money. I leaned over the bench, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried to every corner of the room. You don't have a right to unjust enrichment. You don't have a right to keep $2,000 for 15 hours of nothing. If you were a dealership, there would be a cooling off period. If you were a decent human being, you would have taken $50 for your time and sent him on his way. But you're not a dealership, and you're certainly not a decent human being. I looked at the contract on the notebook paper. Again, this isn't even a contract. It's a receipt. And a receipt with non-refundable written on it doesn't supersede the laws of equity. You think you're a genius because you found a word in a dictionary. Well, I have a few words for you, and one of them is judgment. Wait, Greg barked. I have proof he was stalking me. He came to my house on Thursday night. I have it on my Ring camera. He was trying to intimidate me. Mark, I asked, did you go there? Judge, I went there with my dad, Mark explained. My dad wanted to try to talk to him man to man. We didn't even get out of the car. Mister. Miller came out onto the porch with a baseball bat and started screaming that he'd called the cops. We just turned around and left. We didn't even say a word. A baseball bat? I looked at Greg. You met a kid and his father with a baseball bat because they wanted to discuss a refund for a bike they didn't buy? Are you auditioning for a role in a mob movie, or are you just naturally this much of a menace? I was defending my property, Greg shouted. They were trespassing. They were in the street, according to you, I countered. Standing in the street isn't trespassing. It's called being a neighbor. You used intimidation and the threat of violence to keep money that didn't belong to you. That tells me everything I need to know about your logical defense. I sat back, my heart pounding with the kind of righteous anger that only comes from seeing a bully in action. You know, Mr. Miller, I see people like you all the time. You think that because you're louder and meaner than everyone else, the rules don't apply. You think you can treat people like garbage and then hide behind a scrap of paper. But you forgot one thing. I'm louder than you. I'm meaner than you when I need to be. And I actually know what I'm talking about. I looked at Mark. Mark, you're getting your money back. All of it. And I want you to take this as a lesson. Don't ever, and I mean ever, give a stranger $2,000 in a Zelle transfer without a real notarized contract and a clear understanding of the terms. You got lucky today because this man is a particularly clumsy liar. Next time, you might not be so fortunate. Thank you, Judge Judy, Mark said, his shoulders finally dropping from around his ears. I turned my focus back to Greg Miller. He was stewing, his breath coming in short, angry bursts. He looked like he wanted to jump over the bench. As for you, Mr. Miller, I said, picking up my pen to sign the order, you're lucky I'm just a civil court judge. Because if I were a prosecutor, I'd be looking at a theft by deception charge for the way you handled this. You had no intention of being fair. You had no intention of being honest. You just wanted a payday. This is a joke, Greg muttered. A total joke. The only joke here is your business, sir, I snapped. You're going to return the $2,000. And because you decided to be a tough guy and block him and threaten him with a bat, I'm also going to award him the maximum interest allowed by law from the date of the Zelle transfer, plus his court costs. How's that for the real world? Greg's mouth hung open. You can't add interest. That wasn't in the claim. I can do whatever is necessary to achieve justice. I slammed the gavel down. Judgment for the plaintiff in the amount of $2,000, plus interest, plus court costs. Your non-refundable fantasy is over, Mr. Miller. Get out of my courtroom. I stood up, my robe snapping as I turned. I didn't wait for him to respond. I could hear him starting to yell at Bird, but I knew Bird could handle him. Bird has handled bigger and meaner men than Greg Miller without even putting down his crossword puzzle. As I walked toward my chambers, I felt a sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about the motorcycle. It wasn't even about the $2,000. It was about the fact that a bully went home a little poorer and a lot more frustrated than he arrived. And that, in my book, is a very good day's work. I pushed open my door and sat down at my desk. I took a sip of my water and looked at the next file. Bird, I called out. Next case. And tell the next person that if they have a non-refundable deposit on a hamster, they better stay home. I heard Bird's dry chuckle from the hallway. Justice was served, and my coffee was still warm. That's a win-win in the only real world that matters.